You're standing in the middle of nowhere. It's freezing cold. It's raining. Something in the forest is making a sound that you definitely don't like, and your only tools are a rock and a vague memory of that one survival YouTube video you watched at 2 a.m. 3 months ago. You're dead. You know it. I know it. But here's the insane part. Our ancestors, they thrived in this exact situation for hundreds of thousands of years, with zero technology, zero internet, and absolutely zero idea that one day their descendants would struggle to survive a mild power outage. And the techniques they used? Completely wild. First up, and this one immediately sounds insane, ancient humans used to eat clay, not like a dare. Not by accident, on purpose. Deliberately. Like a snack. Anthropologists first noticed this when they were studying indigenous tribes in South America, Africa, and parts of Asia. People were eating dirt, specifically a certain type of clay. And the researchers thought, okay, clearly something has gone horribly wrong here. Except it hadn't, because it turns out that clay, the right kind, acts like a natural detox system for the body. When you're in a survival situation, a lot of the things you can eat in the wild are technically toxic if eaten in large quantities. Certain plants, roots, and tubers contain alkaloids, tannins, and other compounds that your gut does not appreciate. Clay binds to these toxins in your digestive system and basically escorts them out before they can do damage. The Andes people in Peru famously ate wild potatoes this way. Potatoes that would be too bitter and toxic to eat on their own. Dipped in clay sauce. Like literally dipping their food in clay. And it worked. It neutralized the compounds and made the food safe to eat. Pregnant women across dozens of cultures throughout history have been documented eating clay, and researchers now believe it was an instinctive response to get extra minerals, specifically calcium and iron, that their bodies desperately needed. There's even a name for this behavior, geophagy, which is a fancy scientific word for eating dirt. And the fact that scientists gave it a proper Latin name means enough people were doing it consistently enough that it demanded formal study. Your ancestors literally ate dirt and were smarter than you? Incredible. Now here's one that's going to make you rethink every camping trip you've ever taken. Ancient humans, and this is documented across multiple continents, used animal fat as a full-body survival tool. And when I say full body, I mean full body. Think about this. You're in the Arctic, it's minus 30 degrees. You have no Gore-Tex jacket, no thermal underwear. You have animal skins and whatever your own brain can come up with. What do? You rub rendered animal fat all over your skin. Inuit people did this routinely. It creates a water-resistant, insulating barrier on the skin that genuinely reduces heat loss. It's basically DIY wetsuit technology. Fat from seals and bears was particularly prized because of the density of the lipid layer it created. Modern tests have actually confirmed this works. It's not as good as a proper wetsuit, but in an emergency, it makes a measurable difference to your core temperature. But wait, it gets better. The same fat was also used as fuel for lamps. You'd soak a piece of moss or dried plant fiber in it, and you had a light source that could burn for hours. It was used to waterproof leather and skins to make better shelters. It was mixed with dried meat and berries to make pemmican, one of the most calorie-dense survival foods ever invented, which we'll get back to in a minute. It was used to grease tools to prevent deterioration and improve function. And in some cultures, it was mixed with red ochre pigment and smeared on the body not just for warmth, but as a form of sunscreen against the brutal glare of snow and ice. One dead animal, every single part used, nothing wasted. These people were not primitive. They were running a circular economy before the term was invented. All right, here's where things get properly medieval. Urine therapy. Before you click away, just hear me out for 30 seconds. Because the science here is genuinely fascinating, and I promise it's not as bad as it sounds. Well, it is as bad as it sounds. But the results are real. Ancient Romans, Vikings, medieval European peasants, and numerous Asian cultures all documented the use of urine for survival and medical purposes. Fresh urine is sterile, meaning it contains no bacteria when it leaves the body. It's also rich in urea, a compound with real antiseptic properties. So what did they use it for? Wounds. If you had a cut, a gash, an infected wound, and you had nothing else available, fresh urine poured over the wound actually inhibited bacterial growth and helped prevent infection. Roman soldiers were documented doing this on battlefields. It sounds insane. But when the alternative is gangrene and death, suddenly it's a very reasonable option. Viking warriors are also documented using urine to tan leather. Urea breaks down proteins in hide and softens it. It was used as an early form of bleach in textile dyeing. Some Nordic communities used aged urine, which is even more concentrated in ammonia, as a cleaning agent and even a kind of early detergent. And here's the one that always gets people. There are accounts of survival situations at sea, shipwrecks, people stranded on rafts, where fresh urine was used to soak cloth that was then held over the nose and mouth, acting as a crude filter during exposure to smoke or toxic air. Your ancestors were absolutely feral, and I respect every single one of them. Now let's talk about one of the most sophisticated survival techniques ever developed, and it involves no tools whatsoever. It's called persistence hunting, and it is the most metal thing a human being can do. Here's how it works. You find an animal, let's say an antelope or a kudu. You don't have a bow, you don't have a spear long range enough to make the kill from distance, you don't have a trap ready, so you just start running after it. The animal bolts, obviously. It's massively faster than you. It runs. You keep running. The animal thinks it's lost you. You find its tracks. You keep running. It stops to rest. You keep running. You're not fast, but you are absolutely relentless. You don't stop. And here's the biological twist that makes this work. Most quadrupeds, four-legged animals, cannot pant and run at the same time. They thermoregulate through panting, but their breathing is locked to their stride when galloping. Humans, on the other hand, can sweat and thermoregulate while running continuously. We were literally built for this. So over the course of 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours of continuous pursuit across the savannah, the animal overheats. Its body temperature rises to dangerous levels. It starts to slow, and then you just walk up to it, exhausted and confused. And that's it. The Kungsan people of the Kalahari still practice this. Researchers ran alongside them and documented it. It works. It has always worked, and it's why humans have these weird flat feet, these long legs, these big gluteal muscles, and this absolutely bonkers ability to run for hours without stopping compared to almost every other primate on Earth. Your glutes exist because your ancestors ran animals to death with sheer stubbornness. Tell that to your personal trainer. Here's a hack that sounds like a fairy tale, but is completely documented. Fire from ice. Yes, you can start a fire with ice, and not in some experimental lab setting. This was practiced in the Arctic by indigenous peoples in real survival conditions. The technique, you take a piece of clear ice, and it needs to be clear, not cloudy, and you shape it into a lens, a convex lens like a magnifying glass, but made of ice. You use your hands, a knife, or even just the warmth of your palms to smooth and shape it. Then you angle it toward the sun. Focus the beam onto a piece of tinder, dried moss, char cloth, or fungus, and you hold it there. The concentrated solar energy creates enough heat to ignite the tinder. You then transfer that tiny ember into a fire bundle and blow it into flame. There are documented accounts of this from Arctic explorers and researchers who have replicated it multiple times. It works. It takes patience and clear ice, but it works. And it's one of those solutions that is so elegant, so counterintuitive, using the very thing that's trying to freeze you to death to create fire, that it feels like it came from a movie. But here's what's even more impressive. The indigenous peoples who used this technique understood the optics intuitively. They knew how thick the lens needed to be, they knew the right curvature, they knew to use it at midday when the sun was highest. This was applied physics developed without a physics textbook. Just thousands of hours of experimentation, failure, and intelligence passed down through generations. Let's talk food. Because the ancient world's approach to food preservation is both brilliant and deeply, deeply unpleasant fermentation first. Almost every ancient culture independently discovered that letting food rot in a very specific, controlled way made it last longer and more nutritious. The Vikings made fermented shark, hakarl, by burying Greenland shark underground for months, allowing toxic ammonia compounds to break down until it was safe to eat. The smell would knock you sideways at 20 feet. The taste is reportedly like eating a strong cheese that has personally offended you, but it lasted through winter when nothing else did. Various Asian cultures developed similar techniques with fish sauce, which the Romans also used obsessively under the name garum. You take fish, You salt them heavily, you let them liquefy over months into a paste that smells like the apocalypse, and what you end up with is a sauce absolutely loaded with umami, protein, and B vitamins that gave people nutritional advantages they didn't even understand they were getting. And then there's pemmican, the survival food I mentioned earlier. Developed by indigenous peoples of North America, it's made by taking dried powdered meat, rendering animal fat, mixing them together at roughly a 50-50 ratio, and sometimes adding dried berries. You press it into cakes, and those cakes, if kept dry and cool, can last years. Years. With full protein and fat macros intact, Arctic explorers in the 1800s brought pemmican on expeditions specifically because nothing else lasted as long or provided as many calories per ounce. The ones who used it survived. The ones who relied on other food sources often didn't. Sir Ernest Shackleton's expedition carried it. Robert Peary brought it to the North Pole. Ancient human nutritional science, developed over thousands of years of trial and error, was so effective that it literally saved the lives of modern explorers who came along centuries later with all their advanced civilization and still needed the original recipe. Now, here's one that will absolutely blow your mind about ancient wound care. Before antibiotics, infection was the #1 killer in any survival situation. You could survive being stabbed. You could survive a bear attack. You could survive a broken leg. But if the wound got infected, it was usually over. Ancient people knew this, and the solutions they developed are extraordinary. Honey. Specifically raw, unpasteurized honey. Egyptian medical papyri from 3,000 years ago document honey being used on wounds. Every major ancient civilization, Greeks, Romans, Chinese, Indian, Middle Eastern, has documented records of honey as a wound treatment. And here's why it works. Honey has an extremely low water content, which means bacteria cannot grow in it. It also contains hydrogen peroxide, which is produced naturally by the enzyme glucose oxidase. And it creates a moist healing environment that promotes tissue regeneration without letting bacteria thrive. Modern medicine has actually brought honey back into clinical practice. Manuka honey is now used in medically approved wound dressings for hard-to-heal infection. We went from ancient Egypt to dismissing it as folk medicine, back to using it in hospitals. Full circle. But honey wasn't the only trick. Moldy bread, and this sounds completely absurd, was applied to wounds by ancient Egyptians and also by Serbian healers in the medieval period. We now know exactly why this worked. Bread mold includes penicillium species. They accidentally invented a form of penicillin treatment 3,000 years before Alexander Fleming supposedly discovered it in 1928. They didn't know the mechanism. They didn't know what penicillin was. They just knew that if you put this specific mold on a bad wound, the wound got better. So they kept doing it. Empirical medicine running thousands of years ahead of the theory. And one more, spider webs. Ancient Greeks packed fresh spider silk into wounds to stop bleeding and reduce infection. Spider silk is naturally rich in vitamin K, which promotes blood clotting. It's also incredibly strong and non-allergenic. Modern biotech companies are now trying to synthetically reproduce spider silk for use in surgical sutures. Once again, ancient people got there first, without a lab, without a grant, just observation, experimentation, and the pressing motivation of not dying. Let's talk about navigation, because getting lost is a death sentence in the wild, and ancient humans developed navigation techniques so precise they should make GPS engineers uncomfortable. Polynesian wayfinders navigated across the Pacific Ocean, 64 million square miles of open water, in outrigger canoes with no instruments, no maps, no compasses, arriving at tiny islands sometimes just a few miles across, thousands of miles from their starting point. How? By reading the ocean itself. They tracked the swells. The Pacific has distinct, consistent swell patterns that originate from different geographic directions: north, south, northwest, southeast. A master wayfinder would lie on the floor of the canoe and feel the movement of the hull against different swells simultaneously, triangulating position from the rhythm of the water. They memorized star paths, not just individual stars, but rising and setting points across 32 directional star paths mapped across the entire sky. They watched bird behavior. Certain species only fly specific distances from land, and the direction they fly at dusk points straight at the nearest island. They read the color of clouds on the horizon. Clouds bunch over islands differently than over open ocean because of the heat differential from land. They tracked phosphorescence in the water, which behaves differently near coastlines and reefs. This was not guessing. This was a complete navigational system, encoded entirely in human memory and trained into the body over years that rivaled, and in terms of precision over long distances without instruments, arguably exceeded anything Europeans were doing on the same ocean at the same time. The Polynesian wayfinding tradition was nearly lost in the 20th century as Western navigation displaced it. It was revived in the 1970s when a group of Hawaiian scholars and navigators rebuilt the system from oral history and traditional knowledge. The voyaging canoe Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti and back using only traditional wayfinding. No GPS, no compass. Just the ocean, the stars, and a brain trained to read both, because the ocean hasn't changed and the system was that good. Here's one that tends to get overlooked in survival conversations because it sounds too simple, but it might be the most important one on this list. Controlled burns. Indigenous peoples across Australia, North America, and Southern Africa independently developed the practice of deliberately setting fire to sections of land. Not to destroy them, but to manage them. It sounds counterintuitive, but the results were staggering. Burning off dry underbrush removes the fuel for catastrophic wildfires, the ones that destroy everything. A controlled burn every few years means a fire never gets big enough to kill the old trees, the deep root systems, the animals that can't escape fast enough. You sacrifice the small stuff to save the big stuff. The ash from controlled burns returns minerals to the soil, dramatically increasing fertility. New growth comes in fast after a burn. Fresh green shoots that attract grazing animals, which means better hunting in predictable locations. In Australia, Aboriginal Australians had been managing the landscape this way for at least 50,000 years, creating what European settlers assumed was natural grassland and parkland. It wasn't natural at all. It was gardened. An entire continent gardened with fire over 50 millennia. When European settlers arrived and stopped the burns, the landscape changed. Underbrush accumulated. Megafires became more common and more destructive. It took until the 21st century, after catastrophic fire seasons destroyed millions of acres, for Australian fire management authorities to formally collaborate with Aboriginal communities and reintegrate traditional burning practices into national fire management strategy. 50,000 years of knowledge. Dismissed. Relearned the hard way, every time. And now, the last one, the most overlooked survival skill of all. And it's not physical at all, it's social engineering. Ancient humans survived because of groups, not because of individual badassery. The lone wolf model of survival, one tough person against the wilderness, is basically a myth, at least for long-term survival. What actually kept people alive, generation after generation, was the sophistication of their social structures. Hunter-gatherer bands had incredibly complex systems for sharing resources. If one family had a good hunt, the meat was distributed according to specific rules that ensured no one starved in the short term, and everyone had social credit. What anthropologists call reciprocal altruism, that would be cashed in when that family had a bad week. It wasn't charity. It was insurance. It was a social safety net built from pure evolutionary self-interest, because everyone understood that their survival depended on the survival of the group. They shared knowledge aggressively. A single person might discover which berries on this hillside are toxic this season, or that the river floods from the south in early spring, or that a predator has been circling the East Valley. That information, shared across the group and retained across generations, multiplied survival probability for everyone exponentially. The oldest members of the group, often dismissed in modern thinking as physically diminished and therefore less useful, were the most valuable people in terms of survival knowledge. They remembered the drought that happened 40 years ago. They knew what plants had saved people during the last harsh winter. They were living libraries of accumulated experience that could not be replaced. And ancient societies knew this and protected them accordingly. And here's the really fascinating part. Experiments with isolated individuals versus cooperative groups in controlled survival scenarios consistently show the same result. A group of average people with no special survival skills will outlast a single expert in almost every long-duration test. Not because the expert is bad at what they do, but because one person cannot simultaneously watch for predators, tend a fire, gather food, process water, maintain shelter, and preserve their own mental stability under sustained stress. The group distributes that cognitive and physical load. The group makes each individual more effective. We didn't get smarter than them. We just got different tools. And if those tools disappeared tomorrow, which sometimes feels more plausible than we'd like, the question of who would actually know what to do gets very uncomfortable very fast. So maybe it's worth knowing a few of these things, just in case.